ELIAS KATSOS is doing this event today at the Federation of the Hellenic American Societies in New York on Epiros, using Ali Pasha, the king of Epiros and the entire region, to promote that spot that needs to be promoted, our beloved Epiros. Thank you, ELIAS KATSOS, Governor KATSOS, for doing this effort to promote the cultural Epiros.
Πριν αρχίσουμε τη διάλεξη αυτή την ομιλία, θα έχουμε υπηρώτικη ζωντανή μουσική.
Ότι στην αυλή του Αλή Πασά μεγαλουργήθηκαν οι επαναστάτες, οι ήρωές μας, όπως ο Οδυσσέας Σαβρούτσος, ο Καραϊσκάκης, η Τζαβελέη και η Μποτσαρέη. Εκεί έμαθαν όλες τις τελοπλοκίες του Αλή Πασά και εφαρμοστήκανε από αυτούς τους ήρωες της επαναστάσεως.
Μας απόψε εδώ, τον πρόεδρο της Αναγέννησης, τον κύριο Πανταζή. Κύριε Πανταζή.
On behalf of Anagenisis Suliotises, thank you for inviting us. We wish you a very happy new year, and we look forward and thank you to the Homospondia for putting this lecture together so you people can hear about the place where I come from, Epiros, and how great this country is and how lucky the Greeks are that the Epirotes stood up to terrorism, to the Turks, and gave us our freedom. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the wonderful place that I come from, that my parents come from Epiros. Thank you very much. Enjoy the lecture.
Και των υπηρώτικων σωματείων. Θέμα είναι η Ήπειρος, η αυλή του Αλή Πασά, Σουλιώτες και η επανάσταση που ξεκίνησε από εκεί. Ο απόψινός μας ομιλητής, το βιογραφικό του είναι πολύ μεγάλο. Γεννήθηκε στην Ελλάδα, στο χωριό Γεωργίτσι Λακωνίας. 4 ετών, ήρθε στην Αμερική, σπούδασε στα καλύτερα πανεπιστήμια, απεφοίτησε. Για πάνω από 30 χρόνια ασχολείται με τις κατασκευές ακινήτων, construction industry, και επίσης διδάσκει σε διάφορα πανεπιστήμια. Ασχολείται εδώ και αρκετά χρόνια με τα ομογενειακά, με το να δίνει διαλέξεις. Απόψε, όταν θα φύγουμε από εδώ, θα είμαστε όλοι λίγο πιο πολύ μορφωμένοι. Αν και η διάλεξη είναι στα αγγλικά, καταλαβαίνουμε νομίζω όλοι μας, θα φύγουμε πιο μορφωμένοι. Έχω την τιμή να σας παρουσιάσω το co-chairman της παρέλασης, συμπρόεδρο της Επιτροπής Παρελάσεως 2020, κύριο Λου Κάτσο. Λου.
Let me give you a little bit of background with regards to what we're trying to do. One of the things that I've mentioned at the meetings that we have on Thursday regarding the parade is that we have to do things that promote the parade. One of the things that I wanted to promote in particular had to do with the various aspects of the parade. In other words, there are many different angles to the Hellenic Revolution. And it's very important that we get the word out to our communities on those various aspects. For example, many of you had your relatives, your ancestors who fought in the revolution from different areas. So, for example, some people may be from Laconia, some people may be from Messenia, some people may be from Thessalia, some people may be from Macedonia, etc. And I thought it would be very nice, as an example, to start talking about one of the areas so at least the other societies can step up and basically do their own lectures with regards to their particular societies, where they came from, and give the community, give us all aspects of the revolution that some of us may not understand or know. When we talk about a parade is very interesting, but there's things behind the parade. It's one thing to say that we have the largest Greek Independence Day parade in the world. It's another thing to say that we and our children understand the various aspects of what took place actually prior to 1821 and post-1821, and why, in fact, we were liberated when other people were not liberated. It's certainly very important to do this, and what I decided to do is say, okay, I'll volunteer to speak about a topic that sometimes people don't really discuss, and that has to do with the origins and the start of the revolution. For those who may not understand, the concept of revolutions is something that started in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. We all of a sudden historically think of Constantinople falls, nothing happened in between, we were enslaved for 400 years, and then all of a sudden we had a revolution and we were free. That's not what happened. The revolution actually started with the fall of Constantinople. And if you look at the history of Greece and those areas that make up today the Greek Republic, you'll see that for hundreds of years, there was revolution after revolution after revolution after revolution. Some of those revolutions were isolated, and some of those were major. You know, a more major one, let's say, is the Orb of Rebellion of 1770, which was a major revolution during that time period. The other thing to keep in mind is that the world, when we had the revolution of 1821, the world focused on what was taking place in Greece. Prior to the Greek Revolution, there was a very powerful revolution in the Serbian territories in the early 1800s. But no one hears about the Serbian Revolution of the early 1800s. But most people know about the revolution of 1821 in Greece. And what I'd like to do today is really discuss, again, the start of what I call the start of the revolution, because, as I said, there was revolution after revolution after revolution, but they failed for different reasons. But there was a reason why in March of 1821 that a revolution was declared, and in fact Greece became independent. And it begins in some ways with Epiros. So I decided to take the topic of Epiros, and I'm going to discuss Ali Pasha. Ioannina obviously was his Paschalik. The warrior societies, again, which is some topic that's usually not discussed by many people. What do you mean by the warrior societies? And the start of the revolution. There's Ali Pasha, of course. Prior to the revolution, this is a sample of what the Ottoman Empire was in around 1817. And as you see, it takes into account all of northern Africa. It takes into account Egypt, etc. It takes into account part of Saudi Arabia. It takes into account, obviously, the coastline of a lot of areas relating to what is now the Middle East, and certainly what is now the Turkish Republic, Greece, and all the Balkan nations. Obviously, we all know that the Ottoman Empire was stopped in Vienna, and it was quite an extensive empire. At the time, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was Mahmud II. His reign was 1808 to 1839. His reign was during the Hellenic Revolution, obviously. And he did a lot of different things, a lot of tremendous things actually. He actually helped to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, which was becoming weaker and weaker at that particular time. He also was the Sultan that destroyed the Janissaries. In 1826, he wiped out the Janissaries. Ali Pasha lived quite a long life, as you see. He died when he was 82 years old. This is one of the books that has come out recently. They refer to him many times as the Lion of Ioannina. Other books refer to him as the Muslim Bonaparte. And we'll describe why in a second. As you see the date, and I indicated that at last Thursday meetings, Friday was the anniversary of his death. And Wednesday was also the anniversary of the birth of Lord Byron. The court of Ali Pasha, again, for people who don't realize this, was a court that the official language was the Hellenic language. Ali Pasha spoke the Hellenic language fluently, and his wife, Kilia Vasiliki, was obviously a Hellenic woman. So when we think about Ali, many people have different interpretations of Ali. We have let's say, post-histories of people who are talking about him and who he was, the Albanian chieftain and all the rest of that. But Ali, during his lifetime, and we'll go through a little bit about it, but not a tremendous amount. Ali, during his lifetime, was a person that basically never pushed being, for example, an Albanian. And when we talk about Hellenism, in the court of Ali was major universities, major libraries, major institutions that related to Hellenic society. As a matter of fact, the Library of Ioannina became eventually the National Library of Greece. A lot of the books obviously were burned from that particular time period, but the basis of the Hellenic library, the National Library, was in fact from the court of Ali Pasha. Ali's area, or what they call Ayalit or Pashalik, was this particular area right here, which incorporates Epiros and incorporates parts of what is now Thessaly. So you can see it right there, this area right here. During that time period, we have obviously the Ionian Islands. The Ionian Islands, which were never occupied by the Turks. The Ionian Islands, from an early time period, were controlled by Venice, then by the French, prior to the Revolution, and finally by the English. And it then incorporated, the Ionian Islands were incorporated in Greece in 1864. So this was a place where many people escaped to, and we'll describe the escape in a second. And it starts with Kifira and goes all the way up into the Corfu area. This, though, gives you the extent of Ali's influence during the period of time, based on a few things. Number one, he had a couple of sons, Mukhtar and Veli. Mukhtar Pasha and Veli Pasha. At the height of his power, the Moria was under one son, and that was Veli Pasha. Other territories in terms of Thessaly and Macedonia, etc., were under the control of another son, Mukhtar. And he had alliances with various other Pasadas. So at the time period that we're talking about, at the height of his power, he was an extremely powerful individual, not only with the Ottoman Empire or in the Ottoman Empire, but actually one of the most powerful people in the world at that particular time. The French sent ambassadors to the court of Ali. The English sent ambassadors to the court of Ali. At points in time, because Ali had no alliances. Ali's alliances related to the circumstance of the moment. He was obviously one of the most wealthiest persons in the world at that particular time, because Ali also was a person that took everybody's money. He did fight the French and defeated them. He did then reverse himself and link up with the Russians. So Ali was one of these extremely wily characters in history, one of the most fascinating people within history. He started as a bandit, and then eventually, through his power grabs and all the rest of that, he became, as we said, the Pasha of Ioannina in that particular area. So, in 1788, he took over, he was given the Pashalik of Ioannina. And at the height of his power that we just discussed, he controlled all these different areas through his sons and through alliances. They say his native language was Albanian, but like I said, he spoke Greek fluently. So that tells you a little bit of the story. It also tells you a little bit of a story. I don't want to get into it because that becomes part of another history, but it tells you a story also of all the areas involved with what we call now Epiros, and even northern Epiros, and in fact, even into Albania. His life was one of the most colorful lives in Ottoman history and Turkish history. And Ioannina, at the time of Ali, became the literary capital of the Hellenic people. And there was a Hellenic renaissance during that particular people. There were, again, as I said, various institutions, various universities, and various endowments. During the time period of Ali, I think it was around 1809 or so, or 1808, Lord Byron also visited, and we'll discuss that in a second as we continue. And the court of Ali was immortalized in Lord Byron's Childe Harold's travels. And Childe Harold's story, when it was written as a poem, became one of the most famous poems in all of Western literature. So during the time period when he went back, I'm talking about Lord Byron now, when he went back to England, Ali's fame throughout the West became tremendous because it related to the travels of Childe Harold that he wrote about, which was really to a certain degree autobiographical. And he noted certain things about Ali, about his character, and quite frankly, the splendor and superior wealth of his court. Many people, think of Ali as being some type of savage, which he was. I'm not going to say Ali was not savage because he did some very, very bad things. For example, like in one particular town, as we know, because it's a famous story. One of the people from that particular town had raped his mother when he was a young boy, and Ali kept it inside of himself for decades. And then when he had the power, what he did was he brought the people into a courtyard, etc., closed the courtyard, and burned everyone from that particular village, killed them all, as getting back at what they did to his mother. He was an extremely complex figure, but he was also known for tremendous diplomatic and administrative skills. His interests were modern in a way, even though it seems that he was in this type of Ottoman type of environment. He generated admirement by certain people, admiration by them, and tremendous criticism by many people during the time period. Even though many of us think of Ali as being our enemy, some of our people that our ancestors that were, from people who came from Epiros, etc., they were with Ali at different points in time, defending him, supporting him, and we're going to discuss part of that today. He certainly committed a lot of atrocities, like the one we mentioned at Gabiki, and certainly other atrocities, for example, in public, where he murdered the Klefti, KATSOS, and Doyus. That's what I'm going. It's the famous cleft of the period. Also, many of us know from him from different mythologies. One of them was obviously the one on Kyrios Rossini, that there's a lot of poetry that has been written. And also not Kyrios Rossini, but also the woman that he gave the orders to drown. I'm going off on a tangent, but Kyrios Rossini was married at the time. They say she was a lover of Mukhtar, who was his son. And there's different movies, obviously, and things of that nature that go into the history of that. Some of it mythology, some of it poetic license by different people. And he's been immortalized, obviously, by various folk songs and poetry. He took advantage of a weak Ottoman Empire at that particular time period. And again, just like we mentioned, area by area, murder by murder, thievery by thievery, trickery by trickery, he expanded the area that he controlled by a tremendous amount. His court, you know, where his castle was in Ioannina. And here's a map. This is a modern map, obviously, of Ioannina. But this is the outer fortifications, and this is the interior fortifications. Many of you, obviously, from Ioannina know the city very well. And you all know that there's a distance between the top of this and the bottom of where the water is. The clock obviously didn't appear when Ali Pasha was there, but these are the exterior fortifications of the castle that we saw earlier. These are the exterior fortifications. Here's one of the entrances of the fortifications. Obviously in the past they would have heavy doors in two different locations. As you can see, it was very difficult to break through this area to come into the inner court of the outer fortifications. This is the doorway that goes into the inner court that we looked at a second ago. These are some of the cannons that exist today. And again, you can see the differential between the Castra and the sea, which is down below. By the way, these are photos that I took when I was in Ioannina. So, including of the fortifications. So, these are some of the weapons that Ali had. There's a museum, obviously, which is in the island off of Ioannina, which they have a museum relating to Ali Pasha. And obviously, you can see by some of these weapons the beauty and the richness of Ali. Some more weapons. This is inside the monastery where he was killed, which is also the museum. What you see here is the actual pipe. Remember the pipe that he was smoking when he was in the water in the canoe? This is the pipe that he smoked. This is where he was basically lying around, and I'll show you later where he got killed. Ali's court related to different types of people that were in a court, and the power of Ali had not only to do with what people like to say his Albanian warriors or things of that nature, but it also had to do with his Hellenic warriors. And they included, among other people from Himara, people from Suli, clefts of the area, and Madagi of the area. Historically, it's something we do not talk about. But when you read certain books that are really into certain histories, they talk about the warrior societies. And they bring out 3 societies, and what they mean by societies, they mean whole areas that were basically under their own autonomous control at the time period, even though some of them may have paid some fees, etc., to the Ottoman court. But there were 3 that the historians talk about in terms of being warrior societies. One of them was Himara, the other one was Suli, and the third one was Mani. That doesn't mean that there were not warrior societies, not so much societies, there were not warrior areas in all districts within the Hellenic Republic, what is now the Hellenic Republic. But these were concentration of warriors. These were concentrations of warriors. At their heights, they were able to mobilize thousands of warriors, which some of the other areas that were isolated could not, in fact, do. This is the flag of Himada. In discussions of Himada, you should know that the Himerotes have a long history in terms of fighting with the Turks. And they were never really taken control of. And as a matter of fact, because of the fact that they could not be controlled, the sultans actually gave them the rights never to be taxed by the Ottomans. In other words, it's in Constantinople right now, but there's a bronze plaque that they made, for example, that had to do with the writings of Himada and the Sultan's words to the fact that they would not be taxed, and that is right now in, quite frankly, Istanbul. They had the right also to fly their own flag, and this is the flag. They had the right to have that flag on their own ships when they traded around the world, and they had the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms. We should understand that in the Ottoman Empire, no Christian was allowed to carry arms. No Christian was allowed to ride a horse. No Christian was allowed to ring the bell on the church, and there were some other prohibitions against the Orthodox. So the ability to have arms was a big deal, obviously, within the Ottoman Empire. That doesn't mean that people did not have arms, and we'll describe who these people are in a second. Because many of them were thieves, or many of them, by thieves, not real thieves, not listes, but really what we call klephtes, or heroes, that became heroes of the revolution. And also, obviously, the armatoli. The armatoli, which we'll describe in a second also. So let's talk a little about Himada, and let's just say that they fought many wars from the 15th century, actually, even when Mehmed II came into the area. Mehmed was the conqueror of Constantinople in 1453. It was difficult to conquer those areas. One of the greatest heroes that is also a hero to Himada, quite frankly, is what is known by some as Skanderbeg. Okay, Skanderbeg. The Albanians in particular have Skanderbeg as their national hero. But Skanderbeg was just the Turkish name. Skanderbeg was an Orthodox Christian that was taken into the Janissaries. He became a very famous general with the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and he decided to leave and go into Epiros and basically start a revolution. Skanderbeg is just his nickname. All that Skanderbeg means is Alexander the Great. In other words, he was such a great warrior, such a great fighter, such a great general within the Ottoman Empire that they gave him the name of Skanderbeg. His name is Yorgos Stratiotis. Okay, he was an Orthodox Christian, and even though some people claim him, I think those who may have issues with him, who hear the name, who hear the mythology, and in my mind, I'm not going to say lies, but let's say confusion as to who he was. I have one of the oldest books that were ever written about Stratiotis, and that book refers to him as a Greek, as an Ioannina. It doesn't refer to him as an Albanian. So those of you who have issues with that and hear the name of Skanderbeg, understand who he was. But the Himerotes have had him as a hero during that particular time. And in fact, his sons, his children, and this and that, they always maintain the heroism of Stratiotis. During the period of the Ottoman Empire, also understand that the Himada in particular, which was never conquered, had warriors and what we call also, those from Epiros will know better than me, but they were basically very large families, and what we call in Greek, you correct me if I'm wrong, fares. In other words, a fada, or a clan. Is that the right word? Give me the word. Fares, right? Is that the right word? Okay. So these societies, both Suli and Himara, had various fares, various large clans. We know the famous hero Androutsos, for example. Androutsos was one of the fathers. The Androutsos family was one of the fathers of Himara. Himara, in particular, for a couple of centuries, had warriors that fought in many different wars. They were mercenaries. They were mercenaries in different armies. They were mercenaries for the French. They were mercenaries for the Venetians during their war in 1685. The war that we talk about, Morosini, where Morosini blew up the Parthenon later during that particular war, or the Mauryan Wars, or the Wars of Mauryan. Those armies fought in that. The Himeratis also fought in the various battles and wars that the Russians had against the Ottoman Empire. And we'll describe that later, who those people were, in detail in some of the companies. So there were thousands of people that were fighting, major families within these particular periods, from the 15th century all the way into the 18th century. Very famous families. For example, the Gikei were from Himara. You've heard of the Gikas family, and they also had many warriors. These are some pictures. Again, this was from the museum in Ioannina. And here's a famous picture. Obviously, this particular person was the adjunct of a famous warrior Botsaris, the Botsare, who were from Suli. This was taken from a book in 1805. It was the exploits of Colonel Leek. For those of you who are interested in Epiros in particular, Leek in 1805 traveled through the area, and he wrote a series of books. It's called Travels in Northern Greece, and very famous books. It's in 4 volumes. What's interesting about the books of Leek is that Leek was an eyewitness to all the things that we're talking about. He was an eyewitness of the villages of those areas. And again, it's in 4 volumes. So he goes from village to village, describes how many people were there, how many warriors they had. He talks about Androutsos, he talks about different families in Himara, he talks about different families in Suli. Although by the time he went into Suli, notice the year 1805, by the time he went into the Suli area, Suli already was destroyed by Ali in 1803. And most of the Stratiotis were actually gone. So for those of you who are very interested in this history, please go into the Travels of Northern Greece by Leek. For those of you who are from the Peloponnesus, or what we call the Moria, and those areas, he also wrote Travels in the Moria, which is the most famous work of the Ottoman period of anyone being able to describe, again, the different villages, the different people that Colonel Leek met. These are a little bit of description again from the book that I'm talking about from the early 1800s. This came from a treatise, a very famous treatise that was written by someone, I think his name is Peravos or something like that, but he was the only one he was the first one to write a history of the Stratiotis. And here he described the original villages of Suli, which are at the top. Then were added another few villages, which are again in the first paragraph. And then at the height of Suli, there were close to 66 villages that related to the Suliotis. This particular group of villages are the villages of the district of Madagi, and those are the villages of that period that the Suliotis had. They were able to field about 20,000 warriors when they went into battle. These are some of the villages that relate to Paramithia and Ioannina. Let's talk a little bit about, let's stick with the Suliotis just for a second. Okay, the Suliotis, the first writings about the Suliotis probably came around the 1680s. It had to do again with the Venetians who invaded the Ottoman Empire, in particular in the Morea. Morosini was the general who led the fight. Many of the people from what we call Himara, many of the people that we call from Suli also were part of the battle. And again, this is not mentioned in history, but with Morosini came what we call the Stratiotis. That was the name of them. They were very famous warriors that came from the Byzantine Empire. When the Byzantine Empire fell, many of the Byzantine hierarchy, many of the generals and things of that nature went to Venice. And as a matter of fact, when they came, and a lot of the troops, a lot of the soldiers, they became then the shock forces, the light cavalry of the Venetian army. So many times when we talk about the Venetians came into the Morea, in the Moreat Wars in 1685, understand that a lot of the people who came into the Morea during that period of time were not necessarily the Venetians. In fact, they were not the Venetians. They were, in fact, the indigenous warriors who were in the islands. They were in Venice. And those particular Venetians, who were former Byzantine citizens, they were the people actually that saved Venice in their wars against the other republics around Venice, and which is why they allowed the first Orthodox church, Agios Georgos, to be built in Venice, because of the fact that these warriors saved Venice in terms of their battles. Has anyone been to Venice, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about.
St. George, I went there.
Okay, so you went to St. George, and you saw it. You went there. As a matter of fact, if you went to St. George, yeah, it has a leaning tower, and St. George is on the Greek Canal. That's what it's called. It's called the Greek Canal. And if you went into the churches, St. George, etc., you would see a couple of icons, by the way. And those icons were from that time period that I mentioned, and you would see some of the light cavalry, Stratiotis, being in the church itself in the icons. If you remember, there was a couple of icons with a couple of people standing there at the bottom of the icon, standing there with a horse. Those were the Stratiotis. Let me go back to this. One more. Okay. Again, this is the area we're talking about. Let's talk a little bit about the Armatoloi. Is that our president? Okay. No. Let's talk a little bit about the Armatoloi. Who are the Armatoloi? What happened was when the Ottomans came into parts of what is now northern Greece in particular, and southern Greece, these areas were areas filled with fighters. It was very difficult to control these areas, even though they came in with the armies. They came in with massive, thousands of troops to conquer these particular areas. They could not control the countryside. Even though they defeated the forces that were there and they took over these areas, they could not control them. So what they did was they created what they called armatoloi, people who could carry arms. I indicated earlier that basically Orthodox people were not allowed, non-Muslim people were not allowed to carry weapons. Specifically, they created these armatoloi to defend the passes and things like that against the clefts and things of that nature, and also to prevent uprisings. And these became the armatoli, who were, armatoli means armed men basically. They were armed. And in the north, it was basically hereditary positions. In other words, it wasn't based on who was the best. It was based on your father being the capitan of the armatoli, particular armatoli. And then it went from father. These are the various armatoliks. They used to call them armatoliks. In the 1700s, a little bit in the 1800s. And these armatoli controlled various areas. So if you look at the areas and you know the areas, you'll see the various armatoliks. The next group of photos that I'm going to show you, and if you have time, just look at some of the names, because I think it's important. As I indicated, even though the Suliotes, for example, fought over 100 some odd years against massive armies against the Ottomans, and they defeated each one of them. They defeated each army that was sent against them. But when Ali became the Pasha of Ioannina, Ali immediately attacked the Suliotes. It was like in the late 1780s. And he couldn't defeat him. He was shocked. He couldn't defeat him. He came with an army of thousands. He couldn't defeat the Suliotes. Prior to Ali, army after army, Pasha after Pasha tried to take over Suri. They couldn't take over Suri. They defeated the armies. Ali was shocked, and then Ali starts almost a 10-year war against the Suliotes. His final concept, his final idea, was to encircle the Suliotes by having basically a series of castles around the Suri area. So he encircled them. At the same time, a lot of the supplies that were coming to the Suliotes, he cut them off. For example, some of them were coming from Parga, some of them were coming from Preveza, and he cut off those supplies until finally, and also Ali was paying certain heads of the fathers. Ali was paying them because when he was defeated the first time, he actually, one of the things in terms of the treaty was that he paid some of the leaders. So Ali was also paying the leaders of the fathers. And what happened also is because of the money, because of the payments, because of the fact in one particular case, the Botsaris family decided not to share in the money that Ali gave them. It created a dysfunction within the community. To make a long story short, cutting the supplies, encircling them, devious methods. He finally got them to capitulate in 1803. In 1803, where he allowed them to leave the Suri area, take their weapons, take some food and things of that nature, and head out of the area. And many of them went to Kerkia, many of them went to Corfu. So many of you who come from these areas would know that your relatives were Suliotes, etc. So this is what Ali did during that particular time. And the famous dance of Zolongo, for example, happens exactly during that period. Because Ali, being the treacherous individual that he was, even though he said that they can leave in freedom with their weapons and all the rest of that, the reality was he had people attack him as they were leaving. One of the groups that they attacked happened to be a group of women. After some of their men got killed, they were on the mountaintop in Zolongo, etc. They were not going to give themselves up to the Turks and be raped and all the rest of that type of stuff, so they threw themselves across into the valley, and many of them they all got killed basically. And that becomes the famous dance of Zolongo that has to do now with the sculpture that's also at the top, and a lot of things that take place from that particular time. I will mention this because I mentioned it to somebody earlier. In terms of the Suliotes, the Suliotes, not only the men were able to use weapons, but also the women. There's a famous story, quite frankly, about an Englishman who was an expert marksman, and he was in the Suri area, And then, he was saying, let's do some marksman type stuff. One of the Stratiotis, a woman, one of the chieftain's wives was there, and she said to the excellent English marksman, let's see who can be a better marksman. As it turns out, she beat him. She beat him actually in hitting the mark. The other thing is, in terms of women, because this is important and nobody talks about it, but it's certainly a good thing. We hear about other women of the revolution, but the precursors to the revolution, for example, Moscow Zabela, who was Zabelas' wife, at one point, in one of these raids that I was talking about, where thousands of troops came into Suli, the men happened not to be in the area. And in one of the famous battles of Suli, Moscow Zabela with 400 women fought a few thousand Turks and wiped them out, basically. And you can read about it in the history books. What do you think about that? I like that. Okay. So what I'm showing you now in a series of photos that I'm going to show you is this. So a lot of the people from Himara, because also in Himara, what took place is Ali also had invaded Himara and ended up in a major battle where he killed 2,000 or 3,000 people, and basically that became part of his group. A couple of years later, he wanted the Himerotes to be on his side because he was fighting the Suliotes. And he started to do good things for them. He built, I think, one of the largest churches, one of the most beautiful churches in Himara, actually, was built by Ali Pasha, just so those who may not know that. But in the court of Ali, when he had taken control of these areas, he had his forces, his armies, his people, were Himerotes, Suliotes, and obviously what we call today Albanian Muslims. They call themselves Albanians, but let's say they were Muslims at that particular time period. When Suli fell, and we'll go into the Moria in a second because it ties in, a lot of the people went into the islands. A few thousand people were saved, they went into the islands. And there they became, again, mercenaries for various armies. And what you see here in front of you lists some of the mercenary regiments that they were in during various wars in Europe. So, for example, let me see if I can bring this up here because I can't see it over here. All right. So, in 1805, there was the first company, as you see, the second company, the third company, the fourth company, and what you see underneath is the name of the capitans that were in control of these particular companies, and from the different islands, and they fought in various battles around Europe. While the Napoleonic Wars were taking place, there were Greek soldiers within the Napoleonic Wars. There were Greek soldiers fighting in the lower Italian areas of Naples and all the rest of that, or what they used to call the two Sicilies. They also fought in Sicily. They were around the world. So they were based in Corfu, they were based in Zante, which is Zakynthos, in Kefalonia, Lefkas, etc. And down below you'll see some of the names, some of the famous Hellenic names of fugitive Kleftis and Almateli, in this particular case, in this particular photo, who were in Lefkas from 1799. So you'll see some famous names here. During this period, understand another thing. What happened in the Moria? What happened in the Moria is let me go back a little bit. When I mentioned 1685, when Morosini came into these areas and took over certain areas, the Venetians controlled the Peloponnesos from 1685 to 1715. They controlled the Peloponnesos. There were no Ottomans in the Peloponnesos, or what we call the Moria, during the period of 1685 to 1715. And what they call the second coming of the Ottomans after 715, and they took occupation again after 1715, was due in many parts to this. What happened was, when they took over the Moria, the Hellenic population, quite frankly, didn't care for the, I hate to say this, they didn't care for the Venetians. Because the Venetians were better tax people than the Greek people were. So what they did was they rebelled against them, and with the Ottoman forces, they basically got the Venetians in 1715 out of the Moria. And I'm not going to go into the history of this, but also in the Moria during that particular time period, a lot of the tax collectors over time became not Turks, but basically Greek. They were Greek tax collectors. I don't want to go into that history because that's a whole other history. But in 1770 was the Orb of Rebellion, one of the most violent rebellions that took place in the Ottoman Empire. The Stratiotis were involved in it, the Stratiotis were involved in it, certainly everybody in the Moria was involved in it. And for 10 years after that rebellion, because why did they have the Orb of Rebellion? Because the Russians had told them to have a revolution, and they would come in and basically support them. When the Greeks rose up, they had the revolution in 1770, the Russians didn't appear. So it became one of the largest bloodbaths in the history of modern Hellenism, in particular in the Moria. The Turks sent in what we call at that particular time period, the Albono-Turki, into the Moria, and there was major bloodbaths that took place, and for a period of 10 years, from 1770 to 1780, massive warfare, burning of villages, all types of crazy things, and 1/3 of the population of the Moria left the Moria. So a lot of the islands that we talk about, when we talk about Idra or Spetses, or a lot of these islands, during that particular time period, they were unoccupied islands. And the reason why they were unoccupied islands was because for centuries, pirates would always attack these islands. These islands were repopulated by the people of the Moria. In other words, Spetses. In other words, Idra. A lot of the islands. And also some people who were in the Moria also went into the Ottoman areas of Asia Minor. That's why you see Poulos, Papadopoulos, etc. And you say, how did Papadopoulos end up in Chios? How did Papadopoulos end up in these particular places? It happened during that particular time period. I want to go into that only because it becomes very important to the discussion. By the way, if I'm talking too much, just stop me. But as you see, area by area, name by name, you'll see all the people that were in the islands that were warriors basically. And not only did you have those warriors, but you had also the warriors of the Moria. And you'll see Kolokotroni's name and other names of people that are well known to you if you're from the south, if you're from Messenia, for example, if you're from Laconia or what have you. Because in the early part of the 1800s, there was a firman from the Sultan that went out that said that every cleft must be rounded up and killed. And at that particular time period, hundreds and thousands from the Moria, clefts, etc., Kolokotronis himself, Kolokotronis' family, etc., they left and they went, in the Kolokotronis case, they went to Zakynthos, or what was known as Zanti, at that particular time period. So, what you had there during the pre-revolutionary period was people from the Moria, people from Himara, people from Sudi, etc., and people who before didn't have the consciousness of a nation, but they had the consciousness of being from Himara, the consciousness of being from Sudi, the consciousness of being from Arcadia, or all those different people. All of a sudden, they're all mixed together and they realize who they are, all Orthodox Christians. This particular time period was a very important time period in Hellenic history. Again, more names. These are people who were in the various contingents, various armies, from the Ottomans. They were in the Ottomans. And again, I don't want to take too much time with this, but it becomes very important to understand the power of these particular things. Famous names. They may be names of some of your relatives, by the way. They may be the names of some of your relatives. And there were different contingents of people. And by the way, wherever you see the word Albanian regiment and all the rest of that, these were not Albanians. These were not Albanians. And many times in history, people go into the history and they look at this and they use this as an example that these people were Albanians. No, they were not Albanians. They were Hellenic people. Why would they call these names? Why would they call Albanian, for example? Because the people in the West, we're not talking about the ethnic background of those particular people. What they were talking about was people that they imagined being a certain region, and it had to do with a particular type of warfare. In other words, these people in these contingents, they were trained for a particular type of warfare. What is that warfare? It's mountain warfare. It's warfare not of major armies assembled. It's warfare based on individuals with rifles who were excellent marksmen, who understood the territory in the mountains, who were able to, like ghosts, go through these areas, shoot you, kill you, and disappear. This is how the Stratiotis, this is how the Hemerotes wiped out massive armies that were sent against them, because they fought a particular type of warfare. And that warfare has to do with being almost a ghost within the area that you're fighting in. Shoot, disappear. Again, look at some of the numbers. 1,600, 1,200, 800, 2,300. We're talking about thousands of people who are on the islands fighting for different armies. It's not, here's a list of veterans of Russian and, by the way, that's Venetian service. Okay, na Filiki Ateneo. Look at some of the names. Oh, the noise over here, okay? Lobothetis. There's all types of names from all these different areas. Another thing that has nothing to do with this discussion, this becomes very important. How did like Idra, how did Spetses, and all these other islands become fabulously wealthy? They became fabulously wealthy during the time periods because what happened was they were supplying food, ammunition, weapons, things of that nature to both the this is funny, to both the English and the French who were fighting the Napoleonic Wars. In other words, they would supply the English, they would supply the French, they would supply the Russians, and they became fabulously wealthy during this particular time. That's how they became wealthy. And that's why when the revolution started, they had all these ships, ready to be part of the combat. List of names. We mentioned, obviously Lord Byron. This is the outfit that he had, by the way. That he loved the. When he went into the court of Ali, he loved the dress, the fustanella, etc. And he had it himself. They made him one of these outfits. Quite frankly, it was beautiful when you look at it. This is also a photo that I took in a war museum in Athens. Okay, for those of you who have been to Athens, and I know you don't like war, all the rest of that. In my opinion, one of the best museums in Athens by far is the War Museum in Athens, which is located right across the street from the Athens Hilton. Like I said, when he went into that area, he wrote Childe Harold, became extremely famous, and again attracted a lot of attention to the court of Ali. And obviously he came back in 1823, and he died due to illness in the Second Battle of Mercenary. This is the war that I talked about, okay, the Russo-Turkish War, and it has to do also with what we call the Orb of Rebellion. And again, take a look at the warfare that we're talking about. It's not only obviously Sunni Himala, but it's all over what is now, Greek territories. This was one of the largest uprisings that ever took place. And this was the uprising, by the way, that Kostis Kolokotronis, who was the father of Theodore, I don't know if many of you know him, he was one of the most famous clefts of this particular period. And as a matter of fact, when the Albano-Turki took over, they basically took over the whole area, even from the Ottomans. And then the Ottoman generals actually came to the Kleftis around 1780 and asked them to please help them to get rid of the Albano-Turcos who had taken over the Moria at that particular time period. And one of the major leaders of that particular period was Kolokotronis' father, okay, Kostis, who after they wiped out the Albano-Turki, whose capital was basically Tripoli at that time. That's when Tripoli started to become the capital of the Moria in terms of the Ottomans. Those battles created a situation, and this is in history books and this is in travel logs that we can read. When travelers would come after that time period, they would see a mountain of heads. There would be 5,000 to 10,000 heads in a mountain outside the walls of Tripoli, and it had to do with the post-battles of this particular time period. Kostis obviously then fought the Turks. He ended up getting killed, as everyone knows. And for those who are into history, or those who are into the Kolokotroneika, what they call the Kolokotroneika, many of the times people confuse Kostis with his son Theodore. Because a lot of the things that took place, a lot of the battles that sometimes they mention in the Kolokotroneika were actually not Theodore Kolokotronis, but they were actually his father, Kostis. Okay, this is another book that came out. Catherine Fleming, who's someone we all know, came out with The Muslim Bonaparte. This talks about obviously Ali Pasha. We talk about another character, Sultan Mahmud, II, and then Khurshid Pasha. So we're coming now to the situation and the discussion, and we're here to basically come to the bottom line of what took place. I mentioned to you the concept of what was going on in Himara. I mentioned to you the Stratiotis. I mentioned to you the power of Ali Pasha. And what took place around 1820, actually happened in 1819. The Sultan always had a problem with Ali, because Ali was extremely powerful. He was almost an autocrat within his own area. He was in some ways more powerful than the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And what happened was there was a particular Pasha that was in the court of Ali that happened to be friendly with the Sultan. And he was sending him messages. Ali is basically going to be autonomous. Ali is going to separate himself from the empire. Ali controls this whole spot. And Ali, who heard this and knew this, because Ali had one of the, we're talking about the KGB and the CIA and all the rest of that, Ali had one of the foremost intelligence services in the world at that time. He had spies everywhere. He had spies in France, he had spies in England, he had spies in Russia, he had spies everywhere, all over the territories. That's why the Fidikiya Teria really couldn't come into Ali's territories, because they were afraid. Because Ali knew everything that was going on. Well, this particular Pasha that was giving word to the Sultan that Ali was thinking of that, Ali knew what was going on and had to get rid of him. He sent three assassins to Constantinople in the latter part of 1819 to assassinate the Pasha. They failed. The Albanians failed. They got caught. And then, obviously, they tortured them and got the word that they were sent by Ali to kill the Pasha, basically. And the Sultan then decided to raise an army and to go against Ali and wipe him out. First he said to Ali, before he raised the army, he gave him 43 days to come to Constantinople to explain what took place. Ali basically said to him, pardon the expression, screw you. Okay, he basically said, I'm not coming. You know, and he declared himself, you know, the despot of the area, and he couldn't care less. So the Sultan raised an army of thousands. He called the other Pashadas from all over Greece, and he put at the head of the army the Pasha that Ali went to assassinate. And the forces in 1820, thousands of troops gathered, and they attacked Ali. Not only did they attack Ali and Ioannina, etc., they were having trouble defeating him. The Ottoman forces also then, when the armies were being defeated, they couldn't capture Ali, they couldn't take over Ioannina. Thousands, we're talking about 20, 30, 40,000 troops were outside of Ioannina trying to take control. They couldn't take control of the particular area. The Sultan then went and sent messages to the Stratiotis and the Chimerotis, but in particular the Stratiotis, and told them to come and join the Ottoman forces against Ali. The Stratiotis hated Ali because obviously he took over Sudi, he forced them out of Sudi, so they joined the forces and they were promised that they were going to get paid, they would be able to come into Sudi and all the rest of it. As it turned out, the Pasha, who was leading trying to capture Ali, reneged. They didn't pay the Stratiotis their money that they promised them. They didn't allow them to go into Sudi. And then Ali becomes Ali. Ali then starts negotiations with the Stratiotis. The same Stratiotis that were fighting with the Ottomans, and tells them, why are you fighting with these people? I'll give you Sudi, and I'll pay you and all the rest of it. So while this was all going on, the Stratiotis reversed and basically joined the forces of Ali. In other words, against the Ottoman forces. So it's kind of strange, but this is who Ali was. And again, during that time period, the Stratiotis wanted to go back to Sudi. Even though they were gone for decades from Sudi, they wanted to go back to their villages. When they came back, Ali did allow them to go into Sudi. They did, in fact, take over the Stratiotic villages, and they started again to expand the Stratiotical area during the period of the warfare that we're talking about. So the warfare started, like we said, in 1820. It was obvious that there was problems as they were fighting Ali. It was obviously they couldn't take over Ali. And then the Sultan asks one of his generals to join the battle. And this is Khurshid Pasha. Khurshid Pasha was born in Georgia. He was taken as a child. He was a Christian. He was a Janissary. He became a very famous general. And Khurshid Pasha at that particular time was made the governor of the Moria. In other words, he took over the Moria and was the governor of the Moria. Around the period of about January of 1821, the Sultan asks him to check what's going on, even before, actually the end of 1820. Asked him to go around the Moria and see what was going on, because word was trying to filter out that a revolution may start. So he asked Khurshid, in particular in the Moria, and he asked Khurshid to check it out. Khurshid invited all the leaders of the Hellenic community to come into Tripolitsa to have a discussion, etc. And after that discussion, he felt confident that there was no revolution starting. Yeah, there was some action that took place in India, a couple of people got killed, or what have you, but there's no revolution taking place. In the meanwhile, just as a back step, and again, I'm talking long, but it's important. As a back step, the EMBCA, which was watching all this, realized that thousands of troops were in Ioannina. They amongst themselves, and the various people who were part of the EMBCA Φιλική εταιρεία, who were in the Ionian Islands and all the rest of that, they told them that we're going to start the revolution on March 25th, 1821, the next year. They were going to start the revolution. Because they felt at the time it was now or never. In other words, while the Ottoman troops were occupied in Ioannina, now was the time to come and start the revolution again. Khurshid saw what was going on in Moria, sends back a note to the Sultan, says to him, you know what, it looks calm, there's some activities, but it's not a big deal. And then Khurshid leaves Tripolitsa and goes to Ioannina to take over the fight against Ali Pasha. And he leaves one of his adjuncts in charge. It happened in March of 1821. It happened in March of 21 that Khurshid left and went to fight against Ali. Again, one of the greatest generals of the Ottoman Empire, left Moria, went into Ioannina to defeat Ali. The second that happened, within days, within weeks, the revolution broke out. Everyone from the islands descended on the Moria. The Kolokotorne, all these people that we're talking about, that were fighters, this and that, the word got out, everybody was prepared. The revolution started in March, based on Khurshid leaving and going to Ioannina. Now, Khurshid saw what happened, knew what happened, but he had to defeat Ali. And finally, in January, the anniversary, like I said, was Friday. In January of 1822, which was almost, not quite, 9-10 months after the revolution had already started. Don't forget, at the time period, within 3 months from March, all the Moria was completely taken over by the forces, the Hellenic forces, Klephtes, captains, etc. They completely took over the Moria within a few months. But Khurshid could not leave. He had to defeat Ali, and finally he defeated him and killed him. How did he defeat him? It was obvious to Ali that he was going to lose. They finally had gone through the great walls that we showed earlier. They came into the inner castle area that we showed you earlier. And what took place there was Ali, again, wily, intelligent, sneaky, devious, has a conversation with Khurshid and basically tells him that he's ready to give up if he can live and all the rest of that. And Khurshid makes him a promise that he can live. No problem, we'll take care of it. You and your harem, everything will be fine, all the rest of that. And they take him to the island outside of Ioannina in a monastery that was there at that particular time. And so he was defeated around the end of 1821. They go to the island, and to make a long story short, they kill Ali, cut off his head, and send it to the Sultan. Okay, this is the Filiki Eteria. This becomes very important that we're talking about. The Filiki Eteria realized that they had to start the revolution. These are some of the leaders of the Filiki Eteria. The first people that everybody knows about is Kufas, Tsakolov, and Xanthos. They were the leaders. But during the time of the revolution, the leader, there was only one leader at the time of the revolution, and that was Panagiotis Sekeris. And the reason why I'm singling him out is Panagiotis. If it wasn't for Panagiotis, the Filiki Eteria would have ended even before the revolution. But Panagiotis Sekeris, who was originally from Arcadia, he went to Constantinople, became very wealthy, a shipowner, this and that. He had very wealthy friends. He gave up a lot of his fortune, and he got the fortune of his friends to support and finance the Filiki Eteria. This gentleman should be one of the most famous people in Greek history, but if I ask most of you here, who was that person, no one would know his name. No one would know his name. Panagiotis Sekeris. And the reason why I bring it up is because Panagiotis died penniless. Panagiotis died penniless, and he wasn't recognized for what he actually did, and I'm a supporter of always recognizing what people do. This is Panagiotis Epiros, and the other reason why I mention him is I was honored last year by getting the Panagiotis Epiros Award from the Pan-Arcadian Association. This is taken from Ioannina. This is a very famous, as many people know, the final days of Ali is they shot through the boards. In other words, the Turks were underneath. Ali was fighting them. He ran up the stairs into an upper level, and they fired two bullet shots through the floor, and they basically killed Ali. They cut off his head. They put it on a silver platter. Khurshid went to the head and kissed the beard of Ali because he honored him as being such a great warrior, hero, and all the rest of that. His head was sent to Constantinople. His body is buried in Ioannina. For those who are from Ioannina, this is in the inner courtyard that we mentioned. Ali is buried right underneath here. Okay? For people from Ioannina, did you visit Ali's grave? This is from the War Museum. There were people in Constantinople, because these are devious societies, as we know, not only the Turks but also us. And people started to say that Khurshid did not send all of Ali's money. That in fact, when they did an accounting, there should be not 50 million piastres, there should be 500 million piastres. And they started spreading rumors about Khurshid, where did the money go, and all the rest of that. In the meanwhile, the Sultan sent Khurshid to round up the troops, to get ready to go into the Moria and battle all the people who had started the revolution and had taken over certain areas. But it became obvious that the agents, the bad people, the agents were saying all types of rumors about Khurshid. Khurshid is this, Khurshid is that. Khurshid knew what was going on. They were going to send agents to wipe him out, etc. And then Khurshid towards the end of 1822, Khurshid, rather than allow people to kill him, Khurshid drinks some poison and Khurshid dies. Okay? But before he died, they had elevated him below Dramani, because then it came out, the Sultan said that Dramani should take over the forces that will attack the Greeks, and that Khurshid will help Dramani round up some supplies and things of that nature. Okay? If Khurshid had come down into the Moria during the revolution, maybe the revolution would have been a different story. But Dramani was the one that led the forces, and we know what happened to Dramani in the Venetian. We know what happened to Dramani. So, what is this talk all about? It's about Epiros, it's about Ali, it's about the warrior societies, and it's about the fact that if Ali was not around, if Ali did not divert the forces, if certain things did not happen historically, the Filikia Teria did not declare to go in March, maybe there wouldn't have been a revolution of 1821. Thank you.
MGTV USA. Οι δραστηριότητες της ελληνοαμερικανικής κοινότητας με βίντεο και πλήρες ρεπορτάζ. Επισκεφτείτε την ιστοσελίδα μας mgtvusa.com. Καλύπτουμε καθημερινά τα γεγονότα στην Ομογένεια.